Okay, we're recording. So we are now recording, and in a few days' time, we'll be able to share the session on the YouTube page for the BCS, and everyone who has signed up should get an email from us telling you where to find that link, and it'll also be giving you access to a PDF of the slides, so you don't need to copy the slides. As we're being recorded, if there's anybody out there who feels they've made an inappropriate remark that they wouldn't like to have covered in the video, all you need to do is tell us either at the time or afterwards that you don't want your contribution to be included in the video, and it's easy enough. We just edit it out when we're editing the video. All you have to do is tell us and we won't include it. Anyway, that's probably enough preamble and waffle. Let me welcome everybody for real. Let's start the session. So welcome, I am Simon Wallace. I'm one of the committee members of the BCS Consultancy Specialist Group. If you are looking at the gallery view at the moment, you should also be able to see Alan Moore. He is the chair of the Consultancy Specialist Group. And tonight he will also be looking out for your questions on the chat and feeding them through to our speaker. This event is a three-way joint sponsored event. We also have tonight the Chartered Quality Institute representative. We have Angela, I see some wave, so people are waving at you, Angela. I don't see, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh yes, sorry, my gallery views up.
Sorry, hopefully you can see me.
Yeah, so Angela is the vice chair of the Avon branch and chair of Southwest region of the Chartered Quality Institute, which is the chartered body dedicated to quality professionals. It's also, session is jointly sponsored by the Association of Project Managers, and we have Sharon Escobar, who is one of the volunteers in that. Hopefully when we get into the more interactive conversation, they'll be very ready to put their systems on. We also have Neil Doherty has connected. He is also from the CQI. See his message popping up there. He hasn't got a very good internet connection, so I suspect he won't be talking on the video, but he is there. Tonight we have as our main speaker Colin Butcher, and the subject matter is leading mission critical systems projects. Colin is a consulting engineer who's led the design and implementation of mission critical and disaster tolerant systems in a wide range of industries such as aerospace, power generation, finance, healthcare and transport. Much of his work involves the mentoring and development of project teams, in addition to developing practical solutions to the complex technical and business issues. Colin is a well-known speaker on systems engineering topics with specific interests in availability, performance, security, networking, and storage. He has a first-class honours degree in mechanical engineering from Leeds and spent several years as an engineer prior to changing careers in the mid-1980s. Well, that's enough from me, Colin. I think I'll leave you to fill in any blanks there and on with the show. Colin.
Great. Well, thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. So yes, I kind of jumped ship out of doing big engineering in the mid-80s, largely because I was lucky enough to work for somebody who was a very good mentor and manager of people, who would push people in directions that he thought they could go somewhere in. So it's important to me that people help other people, push each other people, mentor them, teach them, things like that. And so for me, this is a large part of this kind of work. So that's the agenda. I'm really trying to share some experiences from the last, 25 years or so of working on lots of different projects. It's really difficult for a lot of people right now because of the way that things have evolved and changed with the pandemic, and we're doing a lot more remote working. It's more difficult to be with people and help teach them for real. So I hope it's going to be a useful thing. For those of you who've heard an operating system called VMS, a lot of my work has been based around that, and it's I've been very fortunate. It's taken me to some very interesting places around the world, and I've got involved in some very interesting and sometimes useful projects. Biggest thing I've got involved in of late, we finished up last year, which is actually really helpful. It's all the core databases that run the blood transfusion services. And that's been really important because of the pandemic and things like the need for plasma, the need for more donors, and so on and so on and so on. So we put the third generation of all the systems that run that into service mid last year, which helped a lot. It was a bit of a push, and it was kind of interesting doing so much of that without going to the sites or without being with the people. So we learned a lot about techniques for remote working and leading groups of people without physically being there. So some of that's going to come out in this talk as well, I hope. It's probably worth a bit of an exploration, given that this is the consulting special interest group. This is kind of my take on what I think consulting is about. So the reason you get involved is that somebody's always got an interesting problem, and that's what most businesses end up having to do, is problem solving in one shape, form or another. And the reason that consultants tend to get dragged in is when it's a bit on the complicated and difficult side. That may be technically, that may be politically, but it's not usually the easy stuff that we get brought in for. And so understanding how to hit the ground running, pick it up, deal with other people, be aware of what's going on is really quite important to being part of it. And the other great thing is that as an outsider, you will see all sorts of interesting behaviours, especially when people are under stress. You carry a lot of responsibility for it. You have to be aware of the politics that's going on, but the nice thing is that you don't particularly have to join in. And that's really quite useful. But it is about building a rapport with people quickly, and it's about helping to lead the group. It's kind of leading from the back, if you will. You're sort of trying to help other people do stuff. Complicated, but interesting. And this stuff is really important, especially in the big mission critical things. One of the nice things about working with seriously mission critical systems is it tends to be quite self-selecting. And so a lot of the people you'll come across aren't necessarily just people who've been pushed into it. A lot of the people want to work in this kind of role and in this kind of field. And that can really help because you're more likely to find people who've got similar attitudes and similar behaviors. But you don't want them to be too similar because you need enough differences that you can have a decent discussion. And you've got to be very wary of how people will behave under stress, because some of the stresses that can happen when you're working on the seriously mission critical stuff can be quite extreme. And that can really trigger some interesting behaviors on occasions. In general, it's good fun. And yes, you've got to keep track of change over time and have the documents and all that other fun stuff too. It's also, I think, worth talking about some of the problems with IT technology. Everything's conceptual. It doesn't really have much in the way of a physical reality. Yeah, sure, you can take somebody into a data center, you can show them a load of boxes with flashing lights, but it's really hard to get a feel from what's going on and what things are doing by just looking at flashing lights. So you've got to have this ability to conceptualize stuff and see in your own mind what's happening and what the data flows are and things like that. And that's a big barrier to a lot of people, I fear, with the IT industry. And also the IT industry is pretty good at hiding behind it. It makes it sort of see a bit more difficult than it is. I don't know. The other problem I have with it is it's not really yet an engineering discipline. I often describe it as being a bit where engineering was before Whitworth standardized the screw thread. For me, a lot of it is still in the art and craft territory. And so if you want things done really well, you have to find really good people. And there isn't much in the way of professional certification to give end users much of an easy way of choosing who to bring in other than reputation, which I find slightly disappointing from an industry point of view. But again, it's a young industry. Things like this are being fixed as we speak. And that's one of the reasons that BCS is important, because it's developing things like CITP, SFIA, and so on and so on and so on. One of the other complexities with computing is this stack of layers of abstraction. Now it's great because it means that you can write and do software in graphic stuff in isolation from knowing much about the rest of it. But it's also really complex and confusing when you're trying to debug the whole thing, because you've got lots of specialists in lots of little areas, but trying to get everybody's head around the whole thing is sometimes really complicated. And when you're doing the really interesting mission critical stuff, that's often the skill you really need, because that's where the weird and interesting problems tend to be, is in all the layers of interaction between all these layers of abstraction that are going on. And there's the rapid pace of time, there's all the people in communication. Again, I'll refer to it later. There's that great book, The Mythical Man Month. And one of the things that I really like about that is the way Brooks completely nails, for me, the importance of really good people and really clear communication between them, and not having teams that get too big. So a small to medium-sized team of really good people who communicate really well is generally going to do a better job than a large team of people where the quality of communication is less and the overheads of communication bring the thing down. So there's a whole handful of things. And then there's also this aspect of it. We're all now utterly reliant on it. I was joking earlier, I gave a talk the other evening, and actually towards the end, my video camera dropped. Never found out why. There were no log files. If it happens today, there'll be a brief pause while you look at a silly photograph, and I will then scrabble around the back of my computer and reattach the wiring and hope it works, and then carry on. But with a bit of luck and fingers crossed, we'll be okay. But we have become incredibly reliant on it, and it's pervasive. And in many cases, the cost has plummeted, it's gone mass market, and that's kind of where we've ended up. And because of a lot of the above, this is where I think a lot of projects don't quite get started well, because there's this massive mismatch of expectations. We don't have a formal means of writing things down in the way that you have engineering drawings, for example. And so writing stuff down will help, but not having it written down very clearly and described well does make it easy for misconceptions to arise between providers and customers, for example. And lots of people will set a timescale on a budget first, just to make things more interesting. So I think there's a lot this industry still needs to learn from other industries and can improve. It is a bit Wild Westish out there, isn't it, really? Manufacturers keep coming up with new stuff. They keep wanting to sell new things. A lot of it is driven by the resellers. So getting good independent information is kind of tricky, and it's time consuming and it's expensive. And far too many decisions, for my liking, end up being based on cost, not necessarily capability. And I think a lot of that is because of the lack of good information exchange and the lack of in-depth understanding. And of course, as an outsider brought in to help lead something really big and important, with a sporting chance that people might die if you get things horribly wrong, you do have what I call your duty of care. You have a bunch of responsibilities that you're carrying, and so does the client, and so do all the other people involved in the project. And in a big project, you might have a number of suppliers, you might have a number of organizations all collaborating, and somehow you've got to put all this stuff together. And you've got to work with really good project managers and different project managers in different organizations, and you've got to work with the quality people to help make sure that there aren't any gaps, that things are falling down. You've got to work with all the people in the business side of all the organizations as well. And it gets quite responsible being the central point for bringing all this stuff together from a technical leadership point of view. But understanding your duty of care also can bring clarity and can help you make really good decisions. So let me pick a silly example of what I mean there. Take the blood thing that we were doing. My duty of care is to the relatives of the people who are going home boxed if this thing doesn't work properly. Really simple. So you're trying to make decisions about something, the right thing to do in a project. That's your yardstick. And the great thing about having a really good yardstick is it's really hard for other people to disagree with your basis for making decisions. So understanding what your duty of care is, I think, is really central. And you can also find that explaining that to the people you're going to be working with can help really a great deal to build a rapport with them. So does going for breakfast with them. So does, going to the coffee machine with them. All those sorts of things are really important as well. But you can really help by getting everybody understanding what you're all there for. And you also need to understand, what you're designing, why, how, the context, and the context it's going to be operating in, because that affects the kind of people you've got and the capability you've got to look after the systems. There's a big fashion for outsourcing, for example. So if it's going to be largely outsourced, you've got to build quite a lot of in-house capability, because when things go horribly wrong at 3 o'clock in the morning, who are you going to call? You can't rely on people being there when you need them. And equally, you as an outsider brought in, or anybody else coming in as an outsider to help run or lead or whatever else, you've got to pass on knowledge and experience, because you may not be available when you're needed. Something else might have turned up. You might have tripped over and hurt yourself. All sorts of things could have happened. So you do need to make sure that there aren't any single points of failure, and that includes you. And it's about understanding the possibilities and limitations of what's there. And sometimes a bit of a cheap tweak to the design specs to fit better around the possibilities and limitations can make a huge difference to the success of the project. And again, that's part of your duty of care, to help revisit some of the design work and just make a few adjustments here and there, or suggest them, because ideally these aren't your decisions. These are the decisions made by the people who are going to live with this, because you're not going to be there afterwards, and they are. But I've reached an interesting stage in my career where I've now been involved in the design of things where the system's projected working life is greater than mine. And that's an interesting twist, because that really does motivate you to pass on knowledge and experience, which is kind of what doing talks like this is about as well. So lots of things here about doing a better job. And this is good quality practice, it's good project management practice, it's good technical leadership practice, it's good business practice. So all of these things need to be done to help the whole thing go better and for us to do a better job. And the biggie is planning ahead for me, along with trust and communication and everything else, but it's the ability to look a long way ahead and see within reason how things are going to change over time and what you can reasonably do to take care of circumstances that are going to arise. So, for example, I talked about we're doing more stuff remotely in data centers. I can't now jump in a car and get to the data center very easily because of all the restrictions. So how would we deal with the fact that a machine needs rebooting and a firmware update? Well, a simple solution to that was actually just to buy some USB flash drives and leave them parked in the machines, and then tweak the bit of the operating system that deals with it so that when the system's booted and running, those are inaccessible to anybody using the machinery. Terribly straightforward, but if we had to go to a reboot and restart the machine, there's a dedicated private network which is incredibly secure that some people can get to. You can then get to the ILO of the machines, you can then do certain things, you can reach the machinery, you can then get access to the things you need to do in order to do some really low-level stuff. And that might be important because if there's somebody changes a spare part and the firmware's out of revision, you might have to go and be forced into doing a firmware update without going to the data center. So there's a huge amount of thinking ahead that's important as to how you're going to deal with these things. So let's talk about design a little. I know this is really a talk for the consulting group and the quality group and the project management groups, but design is really important, and understanding enough about how you go about designing is, I think, central to being able to lead things and central to help other people develop their understanding. So mission critical systems are things that are really, they're there. They're 24/7 typically. Might be air traffic control, might be running a stock exchange, might be running, oh, I don't know, the oil and gas pipelines. They've been hitting the news recently with the ransomware problem, for example. The big thing here is you've got to be able to make change while it's running, and it's got to be really secure, and so on and so on and so on. So this touches on some of the things I was talking about earlier, where we just, something as simple as putting a USB flash drive in with the current firmware on it is actually a really good idea. And if you really get into doing this kind of thing, let's say you're designing something. We designed one of the systems I got involved in to go 3 data center. It never ran in 3 data centers, but it did give us the ability to move a data center without anybody noticing, because we could spin up the 3rd one and then take out the one that was no longer going to be needed. And hey presto, we maintained dual site running all the time. At some point we were doing 3 site running and nobody noticed, which is really neat. A lot of logistics, a lot of planning, a lot of thinking, but it's possible. But it wouldn't have been possible if we hadn't seen that ahead of time and had the naming conventions and the other things established in order to let us do that in the first place. So systems have got to survive all sorts of abuse, primarily people. The key thing, even if the systems go bad and die, which is not supposed to happen, but might, is really you don't want to lose or corrupt your critical data. I think didn't BA get caught in this a few years ago with flight bookings and things, where they ended up having to restore their data from tape, and they were down, all their airport terminals were down for about 2 days, and there was queues everywhere. And I think one of the banks had a problem with their network as well, and they had to do some fairly heavy duty restores. So the big thing is to avoid corrupting or losing data. But ideally, you don't lose any of the systems. Also, if they're safety critical, they have to be fail safe. So you shouldn't leave things in a questionable state from an operational point of view. And you'll also find that real-time systems have got some pretty precise performance targets. Things like air traffic control, keeping track of radar returns, things like that. The systems have got to keep trucking along. These are the bits of terminology. So availability is, keeping the thing up and running. It's a function of reliability and the repair time. And that's important. So for example, if you were running something in the Channel Islands or somewhere that's a bit difficult to get to and you were flying spares in and out, your mean time to repair might be rather bigger than if you were parked next door to a large warehouse full of spare parts. So you might want to think about it slightly differently. And if it was a really important system, you might want to stash some spares locally and spend a bit more money up front in order to save yourself trouble later. And I view them as being a sort of, disaster recovery is what a lot of people talk about, but that's basically restarting after a loss of service. So you could argue you've already lost. High availability, I think of as being surviving, no single point of failure within a site, basically. And then disaster tolerance is the complete opposite of disaster recovery, which is multi-site running. You can lose an entire data center and it all keeps working. And that tends to cost a lot more, and it tends to take a lot more planning. Although interestingly, I have come across occasions where they're doing it disaster tolerant way because the procedures, processes, and everything else turned out to be simpler and easier to test, ended up being cheaper than doing disaster recovery, which was a really interesting twist that I hadn't seen coming. But disaster tolerance done carefully might actually not only be better, but also less expensive than doing DR. So lots of examples of the kinds of things we're talking about, but we've covered a lot of that sort of stuff. I quite like this description from the NASA Systems Engineering Handbook. It's this, it's fascinating, really, isn't it? Oh, look, there's all sorts of things we can go and fiddle with here. Oh, systems engineering is a great field. Look what we can go and do now. But it is true. It's a holistic view of the whole thing. And then, systems evolve, requirements, design, etc., etc., etc. But it's not quite as linear as you'd like to think, and it's not necessarily as smooth as you think. The biggie for me is the one at the end, because it's got to transition out of service and be replaced by something else while it's still working. And that's a fun trick to pull off. So how do you switch from something that didn't exist before, collection of regional systems to a national system, generation 1 to generation 2, generation 2 to generation 3. And this is where looking ahead and designing ahead and thinking about it actually can make a huge difference. And sometimes you'll find that the transition in and out of service drives how you design things in order to make it easier to pull the transition off without having a problem with the data, for example. So I kind of said most of this already, but it's worth having a slide that just summarizes it. But the big thing is do the whole thing on paper. You know, try a few prototypes, do stuff like that. But do try and remain, you know, it's well structured, it's well architected, but do try and adapt to, you know, things when they arise along the way, because there are things you won't know at the beginning. And there are things that will change over time, especially if it's a really big system with a really big project. So it all starts with understanding what you're trying to do. So clarity is really important. The other thing is don't over specify in terms of availability, for example, and be prepared to think about it if you don't like the price of the timescales, but understand what compromises you could sensibly make. Oh, and understand what the acceptance criteria are. Too many projects get started without knowing when they're finished. What does finished look like? What does delivered look like? And that's a really useful question to ask somewhere at the beginning. So you're always making design decisions. And it's interesting with design decisions. So some of them are really big ones that have got really long-term implications. Yeah, naming conventions, for example, is one of the biggies. Don't name things based on where they are because the data center might move. No point in having systems that refer to being in London when they're now in, I don't know, Nottingham. But you do see things like that. Or don't have disk drives where the device names are based on what size they were originally. I've seen a system recently which has now got umpteen terabytes of storage, but rather amusingly and quaintly, the disk naming convention is based around 18 gig and 36 gigs SCSI disk drives from a long time ago, which is amusing, but not helpful. And similarly, I've seen some silly things with networks where, you know, color-coded cables. I think my favorite story there is the place where there was lots and lots and lots of cabling, and I asked about it, and their color code convention was length. So sure enough, the different colors were different lengths. They weren't, you know, this is telephony, this is data, this is email. So just think hard, because some things are really difficult to change later. This is just a quick mention. There's a thing called TRIZ. If you haven't come across it, I recommend exploring it a little from a designer's point of view. And it's actually Russian. I'm absolutely rubbish at Russian because I can't speak it at all. I'm led to believe it sounds something like Teoria Reshenia Itsaritelskih Zadach or something like that. But it's basically a theory of inventive problem solving. And if you haven't come across it, I really recommend a bit of an explore. It's the reason I've picked this diagram. It's the old thinking out of the box thing. But it does help you think through how to do some interesting design problem solving. Quite a lot of big engineering organizations use this, and I've introduced 2 or 3 software organizations to it, and it's been found of use. So availability. Now, my contention here is that a lot of people worry about performance when what they're really worrying about is availability. But the reason they worry about performance is that their experience is that if something doesn't perform, it's not working, therefore it's not available. But because they don't understand that enormously clearly, they worry about performance. But what they're really worrying about is availability and the thing being available for use. And the horrible thing about performance-related failures is that they're often transient and difficult to find. And security attacks can affect things too, and that can bring the systems down. And you've got to have enough capacity and performance to deal with all the conditions that you come across. And usually the biggest workload is during recovery. So it's not normal running. It's not when something's failed. It's when you're putting all the data back together after you've lost a data center and you've got all this data replication going on as quickly as is reasonably practical, given the cost and everything else, to put the data back together to be ready for the next failure. So usually it's running under recovery conditions is the biggest workload. And it does help if you can figure out which bits of the system are, mission critical and how you might detect a failure. Question I always like asking is, what kind of failure do you want? So if it's a real-time control system tracking, radar returns of an aircraft, aircraft can move a long way in a few seconds. So I rather like the failed system to get out of the way and a replacement system pick up real quick. Whereas if it's, the end of your batch job reconciliation from hell running in a banking system, and it's running slowly, and it's already, 23 hours in, and it should finish sometime soon, maybe, you probably want it to hang in there and finish in the next hour or two, rather than blow it away and start all over again. So how do you want it to fail is actually quite a good question to ask sometimes, because you can set the systems up and configure everything in a different way in order to cater for that. And as a designer, you can segment them to limit failure propagation. Same way with groups of people. A lot of this applies to groups of people too, right? But the key thing is protecting the data. And then there's all sorts of fun questions like, who takes responsibility? Thinking about the subsequent board of inquiry or explaining all this stuff to a man in a wig is sometimes a very salutary thing to get people to think about. And you can't just bolt availability on later. You do have to design it in at the beginning. And these are the challenges. These are things we've already talked about. The big thing here is keeping everybody involved and ready to respond. So continual training, continual awareness, and having a proper test environment to train people in is really useful. I developed this years ago, trying to help people understand. Actually, it was a software company. We had salespeople who didn't really understand it. So I really drew this up to give the salespeople a bit of a tool. Does your proposed design cater for planned failures or unplanned things? So if it's planned, we'll call it maintenance. If it's unplanned, we'll call it a failure. So, have you got enough hardware? Have you got a decent enough operating system and enough copies of it? Have you got a decent enough data network? And has it got enough redundancy? Application software. What about your data and your inter-site replication? What about the physical environment, the generators, the power supplies, and all the rest of it? And what about the people? So if you can start answering yes to most of those questions, this just helps structure some of the thinking. And really, to go with that, there are two questions. How much data are you prepared to lose, and how long have you got? And the closer you get to 100% uptime with zero data loss, the harder it is and the more expensive it's going to end up being. But sometimes doing it pretty much 100% is actually easier than doing less. This is the DTV, the DR thing again. So sometimes if you go into this carefully, you might be slightly surprised, pleasantly, by that it isn't quite as pricey as you thought it might be. Performance. This is really important as well, but not, I think, as important as availability. So you've got to size the systems appropriately. I quite like these jokes, a faster machine just waits more quickly. And that's the key to it, actually, right there, is you're trying to make the thing go faster by stopping it from going slower. So you're trying to make sure that the machine is busy, not waiting. And all operating systems have an idle loop, and they do things in the background. So there's a lot of things here that are worth considering. Big thing for systems here is fast and slow. So these are sort of three principles I think govern performance. There's bandwidth, there's latency, and there's jitter. Bandwidth is, units of stuff per second. The only twist to that, imagine a motorway going into London. Depending on the time of day, what are you measuring? Are you measuring people per hour, tons of goods per hour, or vehicles per hour? And sometimes you want three different measurements. So you want to think about what you mean by units of stuff per second. Latency is much more important, which is the delays, and that's the thing that affects I/O rates. And even more important than that is what in network terms is called jitter. Mathematically, it's diff latency. So it's how consistent is the latency over time? And that's what's important for establishing things like timeout values. Oh, look, that data center really has gone. Nope, we can chop it off. And wildly fluctuating latency is usually the nasty thing behind system failures at peak load when systems get saturated. Lots of twists and turns in there, but it's worth just explaining those three things. The current trend in hardware is going parallelism. We've gone, instead of big uniprocessors, we've now got vast core counts and a bit more clock rates. And that makes it easier to create systems that spend all their time contending with each other and getting no useful work done. Because the implicit assumption is that parallelism is possible, but it isn't always possible. So you want to think about how things break down into parallel streams of execution and how you're going to synchronize and serialize those and communicate between those streams of execution. Similarly with capacity and scalability, you don't want to be running out of things. So the big thing here is parallelism and contention, latency, bandwidth, and jitter from a designer's point of view. That's interesting. There we go. So security is the next topic I'd like to take a quick look at, which is what regulatory framework have we got? What do we have to deal with? And how are we going to understand how the system is secured by protecting the data both at rest and in transit? And you've got to have realistic and effective policies, and you've got to develop and test them and enforce them. So what is security in an IT concept? Well, it's kind of making sure that somebody doesn't do something horrible to your systems, basically. The ransomware attack on the pipeline control systems, for example. Or there's a thing called Stuxnet that reads like something out of a science fiction novel. If you've not come across that, I recommend having a quick read. That was an attack on the Iranian nuclear enrichment program quite a few years ago, where people were remotely developing code that would spin up and slow down the motors in the pumps, thereby damage the pumps. It's quite interesting. And then you got to think about what are the consequences. And the big thing with security is knowing that you've been compromised. Because if you don't have good control of that, you'll never know. And that's really bad news. And the problems tend to be, mix of people, mix of technology. And it is complicated, trying to persuade, I don't know, my mother's lawyer to remember to send me documents about her will, password protected, was quite a struggle. Whereas, much bigger, more complicated systems, it's really hard learning how to use this stuff, and it's evolving quickly all the time. And the biggest thing is really protecting against carelessness, because that's what lets malicious attackers actually be more successful. So lots of things here about security, who's taking responsibility. And this is really important because all this stuff's got to be fed into the design, and all this stuff has got to be fed into the program management. All this stuff has got to be fed into the quality and the testing. And all of this stuff has got to be fed into the team of people that you're leading in order to understand that we're all secure while we're working on the project, and that what we're designing and developing and putting into service is also secure. So lots and lots and lots of things here to consider from a security point of view. And then we've got this whole field of risk and failure analysis as well. And security problems are part of this. What's the probability of something happening? What's the impact if it does? So a good example of an incredibly extreme thing would be the tsunami taking out the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear plant in Japan. Incredibly low probability of occurrence, truly awful consequences if it happened. And what you find in general is that most things will handle the sort of medium risk pretty well. A lot of things will over-specify to kind of cater for lower risk things. And quite a lot of projects don't really deal with the enormously unlikely but horribly awful consequences issues as well. Another good example would be things like Piper Alpha, which led to breaking some of the insurance systems because the claim values are so high. Things like that. There are lots of things here that you just want to be aware of from a project point of view. And what I found useful is having periodic briefings of the project team, or if it's an enormous project team, the key parts of the project team, or go around them all, in sequence, invite them in for breakfast, go and have lunch with them, all those kinds of things. And just talk about some of this stuff that they wouldn't normally think about, and just help them develop as people and help them understand that they're part of a bigger thing, but an important part of a bigger thing. And they have got a role to play in helping deal with some of these things. Because what you do find in big project teams is that it's a lot of the people in there will know a lot about this. And you just need to keep talking to them, and they need to keep talking to you. There's another book, Tom Peters, one of his things is management by wandering about. Management by wandering about and just talking to people is really important, because that can help get the information flowing, and that can help you deal with all sorts of risks, not only to the project, but that the system itself that you're building is going to be part of too. You might well look at specific scenarios, and the people you're working with understand their business better than you do. And so they're going to be really good to talk to develop specific scenarios. And that can drive the quality of things, and that can drive some of the project management things, because it's really important. And what's going to happen? So all of this risk stuff ties in with the leadership, it ties in with the quality, it ties in with the project management, it ties in with the external consulting. And this is part of your responsibility. If you're helping to do this, or there's a team of outsiders in, this is your responsibility to make sure that this stuff is not overlooked, and that you educate and mentor people to think about these kinds of things. Then we got the whole fun and games of putting the thing into service. And knowing that it's in a fit state to go into service. And one of the really interesting things about mission critical stuff is that the systems hardly ever go wrong. So there's a really interesting twist to that, which is, if it hardly ever goes wrong, how do you know people? How do you make sure that the people know what going wrong looks and feels like? And so this is where loads more testing than you might normally do, and loads more development, builds and stuff like this. Having everybody involved in this, if something weird happens, grab it as an opportunity and use it as an opportunity to teach people, oh, look, something really weird's happened here. Hey guys, come and have a look at this, and everybody will pile in, and you can actually use it and take it apart and to teach everybody. This is something really interesting. And if you've got the, ideally you've got the customer there as well, and you can go, look, this is a really weird thing that's happened. None of us expected it. Let's go and dig into it and find out. And everybody comes out of that having learned a lot about how the thing's going to behave in the future. And that can really help also pull the project team together as well. The other awful thing is that most failures are evil. They all happen as a consequence of lots of different things all arriving at the same time. It's really complicated and difficult. And that's a game where collaborative working is really important in order to get in there. So we've got to understand how it all works. We've got to, and sometimes there are warning signs. Sometimes they're subtle. We also need to know how to put it all back together again without losing your data or taking it down. That's really important. And we've got to practice and test and rehearse and plan and all these other things. And if we're doing, properly mission critical stuff, we really do need to have a representative offline test environment. And sometimes that's not just functional testing, that's testing under load at full scale. So it's not just, oh yeah, the code works, it does what I expect. It's, okay, so if we actually load this up like it's the real thing and we stress the hell out of it, is it still going to work? And that means you're going to need things to simulate workloads, you're going to need some, test data. And the other key thing with testing is, make sure you always reload the same test data. So you've got, one test is the same, from the same starting point as the next. So you're testing properly. All sorts of things like this. And all this feeds into the whole project. And doing the testing, doing the quality, doing the program management, doing the leadership, making sure that the thing's ready to be delivered. Complicated. And this is where that quote that I've stolen from somebody else, I do wish it was mine, but it's not. And the other thing is test under all sorts of weird conditions. Don't just check that it does what you expect. Push the edges, see what really happens. And then you might find something really interesting that you have to deal with that you've forgotten about. And that's actually just as important a part of testing as any other. And that reduces the probability of something weird happening when it's gone into production. You're going, oh, didn't expect that. Ooh. And now you really are on the back foot, and because it's live. And something bad has happened in the live environment that you didn't expect. And that's deeply uncomfortable if it happens to you. Which is, of course, why lots of people scream for help from consultants, because they didn't expect it. It's all gone horribly wrong, and then they need somebody to come in and help them in short order. But testing is about pushing the edges. It isn't just ticking the boxes to make sure it does what you expect it to do. Then you've got to get it into service and out of service. And is there a one-way irrecoverable step where the data might disappear? If there is, this is a good time to really concentrate on it and break down the transition into manageable steps and make darn sure that there's nothing else going on when you're doing anything that's one way. And often you'll find that if you just redesign things slightly or think about it a bit more, you'd be amazed how much you can get ready in advance and then figure out how you could go back in a hurry. So if you're doing something that's truly mission critical and you've really got a very tiny, if not invisible outage window, you sometimes have to go to some pretty severe lengths to be able to get the old system out and the new system in without stopping anything working. And that's often harder to design than designing the new system. Sometimes it's much easier if you can agree with the business that we can have a 4-6 hour outage and move from one to the other fairly easily. That requires a bit more planning ahead and a bit more thinking and a bit more discussion, but it can make your life a lot easier put the technical people under a lot, and everybody else under a lot less stress on the day. So it's worth considering all these things, especially the people aspects of being under stress and working that way and doing something that's a one-way step and everything is firmly crossed and hoping that it's okay and knowing what to do if it isn't. Yeah. So for example, merging databases is basically a one-way operation, especially when there's still data coming in because you haven't turned it off. That's a big one-way step because there's no way back from it easily. Without taking it out of service. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So it's all this playing mind games, talking to other people, dealing with all the people in your project team, dealing with everybody, going and talking to different parts of the business and finding out what will inconvenience them or whether actually people have assumed it's an inconvenience, but actually it's not, or the other way around. And then troubleshooting is fun. Data corruption is the thing that I panic about. So how can you spot problems early on? So you might want to have some extra code written that's going away and just checking for data corruption and gathering evidence as to what's going on. And can you recreate the problem in a test environment? Because if you can't, that's going to be really difficult to figure out. Anything you can recreate is usually fixable. If you can't recreate it, it's really hard. And if it's one of those production environments where people won't let you touch it because they're scared of the consequences, then you're on a hiding to nothing. It gets really difficult. And then you want to make sure that everything's time synchronized and logged and monitored. Oh, and build logging and monitoring in. Don't turn it on when you need it. You don't know when the problem's going to happen, so just have all the monitoring and event logging running all the time. And then when something weird, and that can give you a clue because you can compare trends over day by day by day. Performance data, backup data, all sorts of things like that. Yes, it's a lot of information, but you can automate trawling through that and comparing, yesterday with today, or this Monday with last Monday, or this month with last month, or this year with last year. You can do a lot of that stuff. And observing those trends can really help you, partly for planning ahead for the next generation of the systems, and partly for picking up on problems earlier and quicker. So knowledge of the whole thing is key. And this is where picking the teams is a bit of a black art, but it's really important you've got people who've got those kinds of minds who can hold the whole thing in their heads and who can communicate clearly with each other and not get saturated. Which brings neatly on to this. These are some military acronyms that some of you may recognize. So 6P, I kind of like these, and they get thrown around a lot sometimes in project meetings. But that's this conceptual thing again. And it's the big thing is the team size and the necessary level of communication and the skills. And so this is why, again, according to Brooks, things will work better when you've got, I know this is a similar slide to earlier, similar content, but it's so important. This is absolutely part of the key issues from a project point of view. So you've got to make assumptions to get moving. Please don't just assume that everything's going to go okay, because things don't. That's what happens. And lots of little cumulative discrepancies will add up. And you've got to have checklists. One of the things that does bother me is people working from memory. Yeah, I've got a good memory. I'm sure you've got a good memory. But under pressure, interesting things can happen. So write it down, check it out with somebody else. I see Angela nodding furiously here because this is a real biggie part of quality, isn't it? You've got to have all this stuff written down, because then you've got a process and a procedure and you can go through it slowly. It's also a great means of teaching people. One of the things I was really wrestling with was if I'm trying to mentor somebody else to do this kind of work so that I can not do it anymore, how do I recreate the stress and interesting behaviors that they're going to experience when they do it for real? And I find that the walkthroughs with the checklists, especially if you've made the effort to go to site, you've put them in an unfamiliar environment, you've given them access to the system that's not yet live, and that occasionally you go, oh, you sure about that? Will help raise their stress levels, and that will help teach them what it's really like. And the other great thing about having other people is, if you teach, I always use this as a means of teaching, and I get them to use it as a means of teaching too. And the great thing about that, and working with somebody else, or several somebody else's, is it slows you down just enough to catch mistakes. You're not just going to charge ahead. And this is so the checklist thing, the not working alone thing, and the teaching as you go thing, all of those, I think, are fantastically useful techniques to reduce the probability of something going badly wrong under pressure, the moment of transition from old to new, for example. And those of you who haven't read the Mythical Man Month book, go and get a copy and please read it. And no, I have nothing to do with him or the publisher, but it's just a really good book. As is Tom Peters' A Passion for Excellence and his concept of management by wandering about and talking to people. It's great. It's really important. One of the most useful things I did ages ago, we were doing a data center move. I bought 2 coffee machines, took them to the data centers on Saturday mornings, stopped by the local supermarket and bought pastries and stuff. And everybody came in on time and we all had breakfast and chatted to each other. And then we went away and did some work. Ridiculously simple, ridiculously cost effective. Great idea. I stole it from somebody else, of course, because it wasn't mine in the first place. But one of the best project managers I worked with was a guy in the RAF. And this was the kind of thing that he used to do. And he was just a wizard at it. It was brilliant. I learned so much from being around people like that. It was great. So concentrating on quality of information decision-making is really key. So for me, turning your phones off, not using email, people in the same room or same Zoom room or whatever is really important. And this never do one person working stuff. The other thing that's really important is good administrative support and good management. And both of those are desperately important. Again, years ago, good story. I did some work with IKEA in Sweden. And as an outside consultant, traveling to some part of Sweden I'd never been to on my own before, just before Christmas, was a bit of a, oh hell, I've got to go and arrange flights. I've got to arrange this, that, and the other. And it was before the bridge over the Øresund. So I had to, fly to Copenhagen, get the train to Helsingør, get the ferry to Helsingborg, find where I was going to stay, all that stuff. And then the people at IKEA said, well, why don't we arrange all of that for you? You can charge us a bit less, and we'll take care of all that for you. Fantastic. Thank you very much. And they did. And not very long before I was due to go, a package turned up, and it had my flight tickets, it had my train tickets, it had my ferry tickets, it had my hotel booking, it had everything, including a photograph of the person who'd meet me at the ferry terminal, and, because it was just before Christmas, a Christmas card from the travel agent who'd done all the work. Just fantastic. You know, so simple, but so helpful for other people. So let me focus on what I was doing. You know, am I going to say great things about them? Am I? Of course I am, because they just went out of their way to do something a little bit more than ordinary that made my life a lot easier. It's great. And that's your job as an outsider if you go in, is to do things like that for other people. You know, if the best thing you can do is to run the photocopier at 3 in the morning while everybody is running around and just be somebody that can come and talk to you, that's what you do. There's some good quotes again. No surprises who they're from. Yeah, what do you want done? Yeah, come up with some ideas. And it is, I think the Roosevelt one nails it completely. That's what it's about. So, and again, what happened to me? I was lucky enough to find somebody who was really good at mentoring and pushed me in a direction I didn't expect. Part of your job as an outsider is to handpick your successors and mentor people within the organization. You know, just chat to them, help them, teach. So it's all about building groups of good people and encouraging them to share information and help each other. And there is a necessary level of confidence to get things done, but you don't want it to spill over into being arrogant, which is a really fine line. You see this a lot in other businesses, you know, surgeons, for example. The really good people always are driven by teaching and including others, and leading them and supporting them and helping them and pushing them and all of those good things. It really matters. And it is harder with the widely distributed stuff, especially using things like this. But at the end of the day, everybody in the project team has to understand that we're all in this together. That's really there. And as I kept saying, it's all this stuff. Your job is to help other people. Oh, the other great thing about working in lots of different industries is you're amazed how much you can steal, processes and procedures. The finance industry is a bit lax on some things. The air traffic control industry is a bit overdone on some things. But you can take stuff out of one industry and do it and take some ideas to somewhere else, things like that. And this cross-fertilization of ideas and getting people to talk to each other is really important. It works really well. So that's kind of it, really, pretty much. Think about what you're designing and implementing and have all these clear things. Do think hard about the project leadership, the management, the quality, all those other things. And make sure you've got adequate budget and schedule. And part of your job as a leader, if you're going in there, is to help fight everybody else's corner on timescales and budgets and all the other aspects of running big projects. It also helps if the procurement folks get involved. You've got to do enough up front to understand what's possible and what's strictly necessary. You can't just buy on price. You've got to understand a whole lot of other things too. So sometimes you have to educate other people as well, particularly if you're going out to procurement to go and buy a whole ton of computer hardware, for example. You might want to look at their track record of how well they've installed things in data centers, for example. The quality of the cabling, the quality of the documentation, the ability to work unsupervised or whatever. There's lots and lots and lots of things. You've got to be clear about what you want, and you've got to be clear about what delivered means in order that it can be signed off and people can get paid. And avoiding the split responsibility stuff and knowing where your duty of care are, that's really important too. So that's kind of my take on this kind of work. Really, best people you can find, people who are willing to share information, building proofs of concepts, learning from it, building simulators, thinking ahead, looking a long way ahead, document what you can. Too many people document what something does. What they forget to document is how it does it, and more importantly, why did they do it that way? Because that's the stuff you really need when you're trying to troubleshoot something. why did these people get involved? Well, because. And the whole point of the exercise is you're not indispensable. So you've got to make life as easy as you can for the people who are coming after you and people who are going to be there looking after this. So there you go. That's kind of my take on this kind of work. And thank you all very much. I hope you found it useful.
Thank you, Colin. You have picked up a few questions in the chat, which I hope you'll be able to cover off. And also, of course, anybody who would like to ask a question, now is a really good time. You can either put it into the chat system or alternatively wave at us or put your hand up on the system if you'd like to speak your question, which is always a more affable, amiable way of communicating. So Alan, do you want to pick out the questions which we've seen so far on the chat? You need to unmute.
Some really good questions. I like the idea of trying to bring people in. The first couple of questions, really good questions, Ashok Singer. Ashok, sorry to put you on the spot, but do you want to unmute yourself and ask questions, or would you like me to do that?
Hi there. All right. What was the question? I forget now. One was, let's have a look, let me just see. Oh yeah. Basically, I find there's always a compromise between safety and the price of a solution. So yes, safety is paramount, but often we compromise on the price of actually saying, well, safety is paramount, but in reality it isn't, because cost is paramount on a lot of the solutions, because they become so expensive if you just have safety as your top priority.
Yes, it is, which is why I think at one point I said, be prepared to reconsider if you don't like the price or the timescales or whatever else. Are you sure you need that level of safety, for example? Or does the whole thing need to be like that, or is it just part of it? Yeah.
Yeah, so the kind of thing I'm thinking about is, life critical. You land a plane, but obviously if the airport traffic control system goes down, that's critical. Yeah? And we end up actually cutting corners on the as well.
I'm sorry, your audio has gone very difficult to listen to.
Okay, right. Put my earphones in, it might be easier. No, just, can you hear me now, or?
Yes, that's much better, Ashok. Yes.
Yeah, I'm just saying. A lot of the times, things. I'm thinking like airport traffic control systems. They can be a lot safer, a lot more sophisticated, but they aren't because of cost.
Yeah. It's somewhere as part of the design decision, it's a balancing act of all of these different constraints. You can't just focus on perfection. Everything is a compromise. And yeah, part of the job as going in to help lead it is to help people understand the compromises and let them come to the decisions, because it's their system, not yours.
And my other question was about ransomware. We keep getting this issue where several months back it was the NHS that was being extorted with regard to the data, and then now we find pipelines are being extorted with ransomware. Some of these things, do we really need them on the internet? Can't they be on an intranet, rather than the internet? Can we?
Yes, couldn't agree more. A lot of the really secure stuff that I've got involved in, there's a minimum, there's an air gap.
Yes. Yeah. So why do we put these systems on the internet? I mean, like, what's the reason for putting power generation on the internet?
I have a horrible feeling that in some cases it's as silly as, oh my God, people can't go into the go there for work because of the COVID restrictions. We'd better jury rig a network connection so that people can get to it and work from home and fiddle around with the systems. And people working from home, well, this is a topic I was talking about the other day. People working from home are a massive security risk. You can reduce the risk by giving them, if it's that kind of work, give them their own laptop, give them their own mobile data router, but don't let them use their home equipment, and don't let them use their home broadband. So
Absolutely.
It's nailed down.
Absolutely. A virtual private network would do it.
No, that's not necessarily good enough, because you establish a VPN client off your desktop PC, that's great. But while your desktop PC isn't connected back to the office through a VPN, you're connected to everything else. So your desktop PC becomes a transfer agent.
I see. Yeah.
So it's much more clear cut for me than that. And that's one of the problems, right? Lots of people go, oh, I've got a VPN, we're secure. Well, hang on a minute. Yeah, just think about this, will you? That's not necessarily true. And again, you've got this rush to working. So, oh no, we've got to give somebody remote access to the data center to go and check the ILOs and go and make sure that the tape drive has done its work. You've immediately opened up a communications path that renders the whole thing way less secure than it used to be. And because it's been done in a bit of a rush as a response to the pandemic, nobody's really thought it through, and they've opened up a hole for being attacked. I think a lot of it's that simple.
Right. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks, Ashok. Two great questions.
They are really good questions.
Thanks for being put on the spot. Our next question, another great question, came from Ricky Stevens. Ricky, do you mind being put on the spot like Ashok was? Are you able to unmute and ask the question of Colin?
Oh, of course. Well, first of all, thank you very much for the presentation, Colin. I really enjoyed it. Found it really interesting. I've just got one question, and that's to do with in a project and you're agreeing on the acceptance criteria. How far do you go when it comes to mitigating and avoiding risk for unexpected and unforeseen failures? For example, the Fukushima. How do you factor that in? How do you draw the acceptance criteria, and how do you draw the line?
The tighter you can draw the boundaries around the project itself, the better. So establishing what the project is and what the project isn't is kind of important. And just getting everybody together and asking, what does success look like from your points of view? I think what you're touching on is actually slightly outside the acceptance criteria. It's more what are the possible risks and the risk assessment and the risk management. And that's a subtly different thing from writing down what constitutes acceptance and getting paid, unless I've not quite understood what you're asking.
No, that's correct. I was touching upon the unforeseen and unexpected risks, which may need mitigation.
Yeah, and so the only thing to do there is gather people together and talk to them and flush as many ideas out as you can and hope that you've thought of most of the things that could occur.
Oh, I see. Thank you.
Sorry, I think it's that simple. It's not a great answer, but I think it's a practical answer.
Thanks, Colin. Thanks, Ricky. That's a great question. Thanks for coming in. Moving on, another great question in from Ian Stanbury. Ian, are you still on? And are you
I am.
able to jump in?
Yeah, thanks, Colin. Really interesting talk. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, the question is basically, do you have a preferred systems engineering approach? Put you on the spot.
As an outsider, it's never your decision. So you're kind of stuck with whatever they choose, however they choose to run stuff. They've got their own internal processes and procedures. You've just got to pick up on it and run with it. You might be able to suggest a few tweaks and adjustments because, you're there because of your experience, but fundamentally, you don't have the flexibility of choice if you're an outside consultant, usually.
No, I suppose it depends at what point you come into the project.
Yes, it does. I mean, with again, as an outsider, usually you don't get asked in as I would say, early enough. But I would say that, wouldn't I? Right? So yeah, you tend to get brought in once the project's rolling and things have already been put in place. And if it's a big organization that you're dealing with, like, I don't know, part of MOD, you're going to have to fit around how they choose to do stuff.
Definitely. I am with you, and I'm in that position, but I just wondered if you had a particular approach that you preferred. So
sorry.
No, that's fine.
I know no better.
No, but that's a great thing. I think is the adaptability to the client's context and situation.
It is, but that's also where remember at one point I said something about stealing ideas from one industry and deploying them in another.
Yes.
So that's one of the things where actually that kind of idea comes up, because you can go, well, you know what, in the final, they're really worried about this. Not did it this way, just they were focused on this aspect of it rather than that aspect on it. If we focus on that aspect of it rather than this aspect, does that make some of this slightly less onerous and we put a bit more emphasis where maybe it might be slightly more useful? But you've got to be very careful how you say things like that.
Yeah. Excellent. Okay, thank you. Excellent.
That's okay.
Thanks, Ian. So we've got another question, Colin, but I don't know the name of the person. They're logged in as iPhone. Apologies. Are you able to unmute yourself and ask the question, or I can ask the question for you?
I think it's me. I'm Monica. So my question was related to migration and the best checklist, let's say, according to your experience and the best practice that you can share with us for the migration projects, and let's say the checklist that will kind of guarantee that will bring the success to our clients. Thank you.
Yeah, so developing the checklists is something you've got to do as part of the design effectively. So while you're doing the design and understanding the old system and understanding the aspects of the migration that are relevant, that's when you can start developing the checklists in collaboration with the quality people and the project management people in order to, and the business people, in order to actually come up with things that mean something in the context of the business from when the transition happens.
Okay, that's a good point. Thank you.
That's okay.
For the question. That was great. We worked our way through the questions. So Colin, can I be permitted to ask one? Colin, you've covered a huge amount. Thank you very much indeed. And I was just wondering if you've got any insights or thoughts after all your experience on how the person leading this can take care of themselves, health-wise, mental health, because it's a really tough job. I've seen a few who I felt very sorry for in the role that you've become very skilled at. So any thoughts? Any observations? Any tricks that you've mastered?
I'm not sure I've mastered any, but there's a few things along the way. Having people to chat to, and I will often use it as a means of building rapport with some of the members of the team. That's a good way, just talking about it offline, just sort of, let's go to, anybody fancy going for a curry? And that can be a really useful thing to do. The self-awareness thing is really important. I will share this story because it's not a nice story, but I will share it because I think there's an important point that comes out of it. A few years, about 12 years ago now, I ended up having to have a hip replacement. And that was great. And we scheduled that. There was a big project that was running, and the client was kind enough to wait for me to come out the other side of having surgery, which was terrific. It was really decent of them. I came out the other side and I got hit by what I can only describe as post-surgical depression. So the cocktail of drugs they filled me up with basically erased my ability to absorb information, quickly think, and help other people do stuff, which fundamentally is all that I do. So I suddenly ended up in this horrible situation where I thought I'd never work again and life was awful. And fortunately, I had the self-awareness to go and talk to some friends about that, and then summoned up the courage to go and phone the client and say, look, I know it's been really nice that you've been waiting for me to come and help. I'm terribly sorry. Right now, I'm actually dangerous because my brain is shot to hell by all the drugs they fill me up with. Do you mind waiting another 2 or 3 months, please? Because by then, I think I'll be safer. Right now, I don't feel safe doing this kind of work. And they were really good. So talking to people, I think, is the point that comes out of that. And having a good bunch of friends and doing other things. For years, our idea of going on holiday has been go and cycle around New Zealand. 5-6 weeks away, no phones, no interruptions, no nothing. Go and do something completely different and get your mind away from it. And the technique I've involved, this might be a useful technique for other people. One of the techniques I've evolved, if I go on holiday, I'll take a notebook. So on the flight out, I'm usually emptying my mind into the notebook. All the things that are spinning around in your mind, write them down. And it goes in a bag. And I never look at it again. And I usually end up picking it up on the way back. And that helps me reload all the things I was thinking about 6 weeks beforehand. That might be a useful technique for somebody. I don't know. Works for me.
Well, that's great points. Thank you, Colin. Yeah, I'll take this and thank them. That covers our questions, but are there any questions left, or are there any people who want to come back in? I think Ashok wants to come back in. You're on, Ashok.
Yeah, I've got one question. It's probably controversial, but I mean, 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, we were all worried about proliferation of our own data. Big Brother watching us.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you.
I was just saying, 10 to 15 years ago, we were all worried about Big Brother, people watching us, people having our data, be accessing our data. And then when COVID came along, all that seemed to have gone out the window. We were suddenly happy to be tracked with vaccine passports and, all these
I think Big Brother's there more than it was, actually, because all this working online and doing things remotely makes it easier. It's just that people have forgotten about it because they don't see it so much.
I'm just thinking it's a slippery slope. At one point, at some point, someone asks you for your health records, and then suddenly, maybe 5 years, 2 years down the line, the insurance will be asking for what's your health status in this and that. Yeah? It just sounds to me like a slippery slope. That it's all this data that we've got is all of a sudden people are asking for it. Barriers saying, no, that's a step too far. You think that that's where we're heading, or is that slowing down when it's pandemic is gone, to society?
Ashok, we're struggling a little to hear you. I think Colin, that Ashok is kind of raising the issue around secure personal data how easy it is to give data into these systems, which are becoming increasingly central to our lives. But what happens downstream? Have you had any experience of personal data and those kinds of things in mission critical systems?
Not really. A lot of the stuff I've been involved in has processed that kind of thing, but we've been incredibly careful about it.
Yeah.
But it hasn't, I've had to think about it on behalf of others, but I haven't really had to deal with it. There have been other specialists, usually within the business, whose business it is to worry, so take things like the blood transfusion service. They have lots of people who worry about lots of things to do with personal data. And that's great. I have to understand that they're doing it, but it's got, very little to do with me, fortunately.
Yeah, sorry, I've got my my earphones on. Hopefully you can hear me now.
That is better, Ashok. Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, I was involved in a number of projects with regard to personal data level 1, 2, 3, and 4, having encryption pipes, having the data encrypted, sending it across the intranet for the government, using, you know, very, very secure. We're all, you know, abiding by the policies and the codes, and then maybe that was about 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, but it just seems to me now all that's gone through the window, because we've done all that. We've securely transported this data, and it's got to the other end, and the people on the other end are now giving it away willy-nilly, where I thought I was giving my data and it was going to be held securely. So the issue I'm sort of highlighting here is that when we give personal data, we're expecting it to be secure and held securely, and not to be sold or given to someone at the other end to make profit from.
I agree, and there's an interesting small couple of stories that I've experienced personally of late. So I'm now, you know, making phone calls to turn on some of my small pension schemes, things like this, because I've just hit 65. And I've been really bothered with, you know, companies you're dealing with. Everybody's working from home. Oh, can you just email me so and so? Just scan your passport and send it by email. Whoa, hang on a minute. What about encrypting it? What about? And so there's a whole lot of people are doing things by email and electronically. You're right, that they're just doing without thinking. And yeah, we've made some decent efforts over the years to try and improve all this stuff. And as a result of the pandemic and everybody just throwing things around by email, it does feel as though we've sort of taken a massive step backwards on occasions. Yeah, I think you're right. And no, I don't like it either.
Good. Yeah, I don't think any of us like it, but yeah.
Yeah.
I was intrigued by the latest terms and conditions update from YouTube, which popped up in my inbox, and it was reinforcing and reminding us that you need explicit permission to capture information for facial recognition. And it struck me that isn't my face my information for facial recognition? So therefore, you shouldn't actually be able to look at me at this time without some kind of explicit permission. It's, I was perplexed.
Okay.
I'm so impressed that you read the terms and conditions of YouTube.
Well, it's one of those "what are they on about now" moments. But then when I glanced at it, I was thinking, oh, hang on, isn't facial recognition information just your face? But
it's a good point.
It is absolutely. I mean, I was working in Saudi Arabia, and we're doing biometrics for the airports, and facial recognition is everything now. Your passport, you scan your passport in, you stand in front of a machine, and it takes a picture of your face and says who you are. Yeah, I don't believe that can be done with a picture. The system can know you. If you take a picture, it knows it's a picture, and it won't validate it that way. So I think you'll be safe with that regard. But the other issue, you talked about YouTube, and I mean, Facebook have brought WhatsApp, and WhatsApp have come back with the terms and conditions update saying we want to take your data and share it to advertisers on our Facebook. Yeah, and I'm going, well, no, I don't want to do that. All right, but you got no option, because if you don't accept it, then you can't use their service. You know, I've been using WhatsApp for a long time to communicate, but all of a sudden now, if you don't accept that terms and conditions, they'll just cancel your WhatsApp account. You know, it just makes it just seems to be going that step too far for me. In saying, well, why do you want my data? I'm using this service. It's got nothing related to Facebook. So what's the, just because you bought them, it doesn't mean anything.
Yeah. Isn't there BCS legal thing coming up that's covering some of this stuff shortly.
Well, I hope so. I hope they get
Because
spanked, as it were.
if there isn't, I think there is, because I remember seeing something the other day. But if there isn't, you might want to get hold of them and see if they've put a talk on about this kind of topic. Because you're right, it is important and interesting.
Yes.
Thanks, Ashok.
I see we now have Neil O'Doherty on screen. I hope you're not driving that vehicle you're in there, Neil. Did you want to? You've always got a better interconnect now. You have to. I can't hear you though.
I'm not driving. No, I'm not driving. I'm in the middle. All right, I have unmuted, but yeah, no, I don't. I'm not sure if you can hear me. No.
It's a really bad connection. So,
Yeah.
probably we won't invite you to talk, but it's good to see you. And
Yes. Colin, the one final question then has come in around frameworks for the kind of formal frameworks of TOGAF and so on, and whether you have any recommendations in that area, and also have you got any comments on how Agile is impacting this area?
Frameworks, again, and to some extent Agile, you are generally going to be stuck with whatever the client is doing. It's not usually your call. It's usually you're dealing with big organizations. Usually they've got established ways of doing stuff that you're going to fit around. I do have a bit of a problem with Agile, depending on how it's done. A lot of it appears to be, let's write code and forget about documenting anything. I'm sure that's not what it's meant to be. And it's certainly the absolute opposite of what I call good engineering practice. So
can I comment on that, as it's my question? So I just wanted to know your good practice, because obviously Agile is like a leading methodology with so many companies following this path. I just wonder, what would you define as the best framework for the design and for the architecture, based on let's say the old school, with all respect, not necessarily being linked with Agile, as this methodology doesn't guarantee the best results all the time, even though we have to follow the context of the client sometimes.
Okay, I'll let you into a secret. I don't particularly worry about any of them. What I worry about is a small group of really competent people leading the design, and what process they then follow to document it is kind of down to the customer and stuff. I don't think anything beats having a small number of really good people doing that kind of work. I'm sorry, but I don't think it's the kind of thing that, you can put frameworks and stuff in place, and they're good for as the design work spreads out or the implementation work spreads out, and they're good for keeping track of things. But they don't help you have ideas and formulate constructs, as well as having a good group of people who are good at that kind of work.
Thanks, Colin. That really kind of brings it circular back to people and back to us. And that's cleared away the questions. Thank you, everybody, for those great questions. I'm going to hand back to Simon now, because I know we're approaching finishing time.
Indeed, good timekeeping, I think, there. Indeed, it's been a great session. Colin, that was fantastic stuff. I think everybody's appreciated that a lot. And some really interesting questions at the end, even if I maybe led you off at a bit of a tangent myself there. It has been wonderful, and I'm delighted with today's event. I hope people will join us on webinars again in the future. The next one we have for Consultancy Specialist Group is as soon as the 26th of May, and that's episode 3 of How to Be a Consultant. We've got a wonderful lineup for that one. 3 people in leadership positions. Kate Spalding from Atos talking about client relationships. Stephen Aldridge from Numeritus talking about analysis and problem solving. and Roberta Carter, who's head of people for PwC, talking about ethics and behaviours. Great, really good, that one. Do sign up for it, 26th of May. I don't know if CQI or APM people want to make any last announcements before we close the meeting. Don't see or hear anything.
I just want to say thank you very much. Thank you for having us. Wonderful to see this come to fruition from, I think, January we started talking about this. So yeah, behind the scenes, all of that good project management stuff. Thank you, Colin. Thank you, BCS, and proud to share the stadium, or the stage, as it were, with CQI too.
Super. Thank you so much, Sharon.